Welcome to Tell Me More Stories Told This podcast. Today we're going to dive into a story that's both intriguing and deeply unsettling.
It's a case that gripped the Pacific Northwest with fear for decades. Imagine the Seattle-Tacoma area in the 80s and 90s shrouded in this chilling mystery.
I can only imagine the anxiety. What makes this case so compelling to you?
It's the human element, really. These weren't just case files. These were young women, many just teenagers, leading lives on the margins, often overlooked. And tragically, they became victims. 49 were confirmed, but Gary Ridgway, the man we know as the Green River Killer, confessed to even more.
That's a staggering number. It's hard to grasp the magnitude of that. Before we delve into the details of the crimes themselves, let's look at Ridgway's background. Was there anything in his early life that might have hinted at this dark trajectory?
There were definitely red flags. Reports from family members and psychological evaluations reveal a troubled childhood. His home life was marked by violence between his parents, and he struggled with bedwetting well into his adolescence. His mother's reaction to this was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly healthy.
That kind of early trauma can have a profound impact on a child's development.
Absolutely. And Ridgway himself revealed he had confusing, even disturbing feelings towards his mother. This wasn't just a normal mother-son dynamic. He had fantasies that were, to put it mildly, inappropriate.
That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And then there's the incident when he was 16, the stabbing of a young boy.
Exactly. While the boy survived, this was a clear act of aggression, a sign of something deeply troubling. Now, of course, none of this excuses his later actions, but it does offer crucial context as we try to understand how his psyche developed.
It's like trying to piece together a puzzle, searching for those missing pieces that might explain such monstrous behavior. But here's what I find so baffling. Ridgway lived a seemingly normal life. He was married 3 times, had a son, held down a steady job. How do we reconcile this with the horrifying crimes he committed?
That's where it gets really fascinating, the duality of his personality. Some people described him as friendly, even normal. It's almost more disturbing to think that someone who could blend in so well could harbor such darkness within.
It's a chilling thought, like something out of a horror movie where the killer could be anyone, your neighbor, the guy you see at the grocery store.
Exactly. And that's what made this case so terrifying for so many people. He was hiding in plain sight, living a double life.
So how did this double life play out? Did his wives have any idea about his dark side?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. Interestingly, Ridgway became quite devout during his second marriage. He'd preach to people, read the Bible aloud, and insisted on strict adherence to his church's doctrine.
Wait, he was religious? That seems so contradictory to his actions.
It does, doesn't it? But at the same time, he was actively soliciting sex workers and had disturbing demands of his partners. It's a jarring juxtaposition that speaks to the complexity of his psyche.
It's almost like he was trying to compartmentalize his life, keeping those two worlds separate.
Exactly. Some psychologists believe he was deeply conflicted, torn between his urges and his rigid beliefs. It was a battle raging within him, and tragically, it manifested in the most horrific way imaginable.
So when did this internal conflict, this darkness, spill over into the acts that would define him as the Green River Killer? When did his reign of terror begin?
The first victim officially linked to the Green River Killer was found in July of 1982. However, it's believed his spree actually began earlier, possibly as far back as 1980.
That means he was operating under the radar for years before authorities even realized they had a serial killer on their hands. It's a chilling thought.
It is. And what's even more disturbing is the method he used. He often preyed on sex workers and runaways, using a photo of his son to gain their trust.
It's hard to fathom the level of deception and manipulation involved in luring someone in with a picture of your own child.
He'd isolate them, then strangle them, usually manually, before disposing of their bodies in wooded areas near the Green River. And this is where it gets even more disturbing. He admitted to returning to some of the sites, engaging in acts of necrophilia.
That's just horrific. It's hard to even process that level of depravity.
It's a level of darkness that's difficult to comprehend. And as the body count rose, so did the pressure on law enforcement to find this elusive killer. The Green River Task Force was assembled, dedicating immense resources to the investigation. But for years, the case remained frustratingly unsolved.
It must have been like chasing a ghost. Were there any near misses, any moments where they felt like they were closing in on him?
There were a few. In fact, Ridgway was even questioned by police in 1983. A young woman named Marie Malvar went missing, and her boyfriend and pimp reported seeing a truck they believed was hers parked at Ridgway's house.
He was right there under their noses. Why wasn't he arrested then?
Unfortunately, they just didn't have enough evidence. He passed a polygraph test in 1984, and without solid proof, the investigation continued. You have to remember, forensic science wasn't as advanced then.
Ah, so DNA testing wasn't readily available at that time.
Exactly, but that's not to say the task force wasn't dedicated. They even consulted with an unlikely expert, Ted Bundy, who was on death row at the time.
They talked to Ted Bundy, the notorious serial killer.
They did. And Bundy surprisingly offered insights into the killer's psyche. He suggested accurately that the Green River Killer might be revisiting the dump sites.
That's incredible. It's like something out of a crime novel. And to think, despite all their efforts, the Green River Killer managed to remain a shadow for nearly 2 decades.
He did. But as technology evolved, so did the investigation. And eventually, it was a breakthrough in forensic science that would change everything.
This is where it gets really interesting. Stay with us, listeners, as we delve into the turning point in the Green River Killer case.
It was a long and winding road to justice, with twists and turns that will leave you astonished.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Don't go anywhere, because we'll be diving even deeper into the Green River Killer case when we return.
And remember to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of this gripping story.
We'll be back soon with more on Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast.
Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. We're continuing our deep dive into the chilling case of the Green River Killer, and I have to say, the more we learn, the more disturbing this case becomes.
It's a story that really digs into the darkest corners of human nature. Before the break, we were talking about how Ridgway managed to evade capture for so long and how the investigation was almost like chasing a ghost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It seems like he was always one step ahead of the authorities.
But you mentioned a turning point, a breakthrough in forensic science that changed everything. What was it?
Remember those samples they took from Ridgway back in 1987? The hair and saliva samples?
Oh, right. You mentioned that earlier. They collected those during a routine investigation, I believe.
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
Back then, DNA technology was still in its infancy. They couldn't do much with those samples at the time, but they held on to them hoping that someday science would catch up.
And it did, didn't it? What a moment that must have been for the investigators, finally having the tool they needed to crack this case wide open. It was a game changer. In 2001, advancements in DNA profiling allowed them to match those samples to the semen found on several of the victims.
After all those years, the evidence they needed was right there in their storage. Talk about a long-awaited breakthrough.
It wasn't just a victory for this case. This was a landmark moment in forensic science. It solidified the power of DNA evidence and revolutionized criminal investigations forever. It really was a turning point.
It makes you wonder what other mysteries might be solved as technology continues to evolve. But back to Ridgway. When he was finally apprehended, did he put up a fight?
He was arrested in November 2001 as he was leaving his job at the Kenworth truck factory. And here's another interesting twist. Remember how we talked about some of the paint evidence being overlooked?
Yes, those microscopic paint spheres they found on some of the victims' clothing. I'm guessing they traced those back to the factory.
Precisely. Those spheres matched a specific brand and composition of paint used at the Kenworth factory during the time of the murders. It was another crucial piece of the puzzle that pointed right back to Ridgway.
So his job was literally his undoing. The irony is almost unbelievable. What happened after his arrest? Did he confess right away?
Not initially. There were years of legal proceedings, and then came the plea bargain, a decision that sparked a lot of debate.
A plea bargain. I can see how that would be controversial considering the nature of his crimes and the sheer number of victims. Why would the prosecution agree to a deal?
It was a complex decision with no easy answers. The prosecution, in consultation with the victims' families, ultimately decided to offer Ridgway a deal, life in prison without parole, in exchange for his cooperation.
So they prioritized getting information and providing some measure of closure for the families, even if it meant sparing him the death penalty?
Exactly. It was a trade-off. He would lead investigators to the remains of still missing victims and provide details about his crimes.
It must have been an incredibly difficult decision for the families, weighing the need for answers against the desire for justice. Did Ridgway hold his end of the bargain?
He did. In 2003, he led investigators to the bodies of 3 victims, and over a period of 5 months, he provided chilling confessions admitting to a staggering 48 murders.
48 confessions. It's hard to even fathom the depth of his depravity. Was he remorseful? Did he express any regret for what he had done?
And this is where it gets even more unsettling. Throughout the confessions, Ridgway displayed very little emotion. He spoke matter-of-factly about his horrific acts, even revealing disturbing details about his motivations and his mindset.
It's like he was detached from the reality of his actions, almost like he was describing something mundane.
That detachment is what makes this case so haunting. It raises so many questions about the nature of evil, about what could drive a seemingly ordinary person to commit such atrocities.
It's a question that has plagued us for centuries, hasn't it? The search for understanding in the face of such incomprehensible darkness. Where's Ridgway now? Is he still alive?
Yes, he's currently incarcerated and likely to spend the rest of his days behind bars. After his sentencing in December 2003, he was initially held in solitary confinement at Washington State Penitentiary.
Solitary confinement seems fitting for someone who isolated and preyed on so many vulnerable women. Is that where he remains today?
There was actually some controversy surrounding his location. In 2015, he was transferred to a high-security federal prison in Colorado. However, after public outcry and concerns that his transfer would hinder ongoing investigations, he was moved back to Washington.
So he's back in Washington State where his crimes took place. I imagine this case, even with his conviction, still casts a long shadow over the community.
Absolutely. Even though Ridgway is behind bars, the scars of his crimes run deep. The families of his victims continue to grieve and seek answers. The community still grapples with the legacy of his terror. It's a wound that may never fully heal.
It's a stark reminder that even when justice is served, the impact of such horrific acts can linger for generations. But even in the face of this darkness, there are glimmers of hope. The fact that the Green River Task Force is still active, still seeking answers and pursuing justice for every victim speaks volumes about their dedication.
Their commitment is truly inspiring. They haven't given up, and they're using every tool at their disposal, every advancement in technology to try and bring closure to families who have been waiting for decades.
It's a testament to the enduring power of hope, even in the darkest of circumstances. Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told Us podcast. You know, we've been on a difficult journey today, exploring the dark and twisted path of the Green River Killer. And it's a case that continues to haunt us, even with Gary Ridgway safely behind bars.
Yeah, it's a story that stays with you, that's for sure. It makes you question how someone could commit such heinous acts and still appear so ordinary, so unassuming.
Before the break, you mentioned that the Green River Task Force is still active. That even though Ridgway has confessed to 48 murders and been convicted of 49, they believe there might be more victims out there.
That's right. Ridgway claimed to have killed as many as 71 women, and investigators believe that there may be others who haven't been linked to him yet.
That's a chilling thought, knowing that there might be families out there who still don't have answers, who are still waiting for closure. What are they doing to connect him to other unsolved cases?
The Green River Task Force hasn't given up. They continue to comb through evidence, re-examine old leads, and utilize advances in forensic technology, all in the hope of bringing peace to those families.
It's a testament to their dedication, their unwavering commitment to justice. What's fascinating to me is how this case, even after all these years, still pushes the boundaries of forensic science. It seems like there's always something new to learn and another layer to uncover.
You're absolutely right. For instance, they're now using cutting-edge DNA techniques to analyze microscopic traces of evidence that were impossible to examine back in the 80s and 90s. It's incredible to see how far we've come.
It makes you wonder what they might discover next. It's almost like we're still piecing together this puzzle, even though Ridgway is behind bars. What drives them to keep going, even after all this time?
I think it's a combination of factors. There's the pursuit of justice, of course, but there's also a deep sense of empathy for the victims and their families. The task force wants to provide answers to offer some measure of peace to those who have suffered so much.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are those who dedicate themselves to bringing light to the shadows, to seeking truth, and advocating for those who can't speak for themselves.
You said it. And it reminds us that even in the face of unspeakable evil, the human spirit can endure and strive for something better.
This deep dive has been incredibly informative, but I have to admit it's also been emotionally draining. Learning about the depths of human cruelty, the pain and suffering inflicted by one man, it's hard to process.
I understand completely. It's important to acknowledge the weight of these stories to allow ourselves to feel the impact of these tragedies. But it's also important to remember that even amidst this darkness, there are stories of resilience, of hope, of the unwavering pursuit of justice.
Well, thank you for guiding us through this difficult and complex case. Your insights have been invaluable.
It's been my privilege. These conversations are crucial, even when they delve into uncomfortable truths. They allow us to learn from the past, to honor the victims, and to strive for a future where such horrors are less likely to occur.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. The Green River Killer case is a stark reminder of the darkness that can reside in seemingly ordinary individuals. But it also highlights the courage of those who fight for justice, who seek answers, and who never give up hope. And if you're looking for more deep dives into fascinating and thought-provoking stories, be sure to subscribe to Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the world around you.